From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Yesterday was just an opening statement. It was only our time as committee members that we wasted on disruption and disorder over procedural matters. But today is different.
Scores of protesters are arrested again on the second day of Judge Brett Kavanaugh's Senate Supreme Court confirmation hearing. We'll air highlights and get response from Hina Shamsi of the ACLU and Vince Warren of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Then, as U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary James Mattis visit India to strengthen military ties, we speak with author and activist Arundhati Roy in New Delhi. She stands with many decrying the Modi government after last week's raids on the homes of 5 prominent critics.
This is brutal arrest. We conduct brutal arrest of five intellectuals across the India. Modi, down. Modi, down.
We'll also speak with Arundhati Roy about the Indian Supreme Court's historic decision today legalizing gay sex. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The White House is scrambling to ferret out disloyal members of President Trump's inner circle after the New York Times published an anonymous op-ed piece on Wednesday. It says was written by a senior administration official claiming a quiet resistance is underway seeking to constrain Trump's worst impulses. In the extraordinary op-ed column, the unnamed official writes, quote, "Many of the senior officials in his own administration are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations." The unnamed author goes on to write, "Ours is not the popular resistance of the left. We want the administration to succeed and think that many of its policies have already made America safer and more prosperous. But we believe our first duty is to this country, and the president continues to act in a manner that is detrimental to the health of our republic," unquote. The op-ed's author calls Trump impulsive, erratic, ill-informed, and reckless with half-baked ideas. The author claims members of Trump's cabinet discussed invoking the Constitution's 25th Amendment, but later decided against it. The amendment allows for the removal of a president who's unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. The op-ed column prompted fury from President Trump, who blasted what he called the failing New York Times and questioned whether the unnamed official exists. This is President Trump speaking after receiving an award from the National Sheriff's Association Wednesday.
So if the failing New York Times has an anonymous editorial, can you believe it? Anonymous, meaning gutless, a gutless editorial. We're doing a great job.
Critics of the administration seized on the issue as the latest proof that President Trump is unfit for office, while others criticized the New York Times for taking the rare step of publishing an anonymous op-ed and said the unnamed official should step forward publicly. Journalist Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept tweeted, "The irony in the op-ed from the New York Times anonymous White House coward is glaring and massive. She or he accuses Trump of being anti-democratic while boasting of membership in an unelected cabal that covertly imposes their own ideology with zero democratic accountability, mandate, or transparency." On Capitol Hill, Judge Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation hearing enters its third day today. On Wednesday, Kavanaugh was questioned for the first time by members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He faced questions on gun control and acknowledged he has said some semi-automatic rifles cannot be banned. Kavanaugh declined to promise he would not vote to reverse Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision which legalized abortion. He also faced questions over his expansive views on presidential powers, including the prospects of future criminal charges against President Trump. This is Vermont Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy questioning Judge Kavanaugh.
The question of self-pardons is something I have never analyzed. It's a question that I have not written about. It's a question, therefore, that's a hypothetical question that I can't begin to answer in this context as a sitting judge and as a nominee to the Supreme Court.
The other half.
For the second consecutive day, Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing was repeatedly interrupted by protesters, 66 of whom stood up one by one to denounce his judicial record before being arrested by Capitol Police. 7 others were arrested at protests elsewhere on Capitol Hill. Some of those arrested wore red robes and white hoods, evoking Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale, where women are forced into sexual slavery. This followed 70 similar arrests as the confirmation hearing got underway on Tuesday. Speaking to the Daily Caller website, President Trump suggested such protests ought to be illegal. Trump said, quote, "I think it's embarrassing for the country to allow protesters. You don't even know what side the protesters are on," Trump said. We'll have more on day 2 of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings after headlines. In Afghanistan, a pair of bomb blasts tore through a sports club in Kabul Wednesday, killing 20 people, wounding 70 others. Among the dead were rescue workers, a journalist, and a camera operator who rushed to the scene after the first explosion. There was no claim of responsibility for the attack, which appeared to target members of the Hazara ethnic group, who are predominantly Shia Muslims. The minority group has been targeted in the past by ISIS. In Iraq, demonstrators torched the main government building in the southern city of Basra Wednesday as protests over corruption, power outages, and rampant unemployment continue for a third straight day. The protesters also say Basra's water supply is heavily polluted, charging more than 20,000 people have been hospitalized from the contamination. At least one person was killed Wednesday after Iraqi forces fired live rounds into crowds. A day earlier, 5 people were shot and killed. Spain has canceled plans to deliver 400 laser-guided bombs to Saudi Arabia over concerns about the U.S.-backed Saudi-led assault on Yemen, which has fueled the world's worst humanitarian crisis. A Spanish Defense Ministry spokesperson confirmed reports Spain will return some $10 million already paid by Saudi Arabia for the weapons. The UN says the Saudi-led assault has spawned a massive cholera epidemic that sickened over 1 million people while bringing millions more to the brink of famine. Last month, Republican leaders quashed an amendment offered by U.S. Senator Chris Murphy that would have cut off U.S. support to the Saudi-led coalition. In Syria, humanitarian aid groups are warning as many as 800,000 people could be displaced if Russia and Syria proceed with a planned offensive in Idlib province, the last major rebel-held part of Syria. 3 million people currently live in Idlib, half of whom are already internally displaced. The warning came as President Trump on Wednesday denied a report made by veteran journalist Bob Woodward in his forthcoming book, Fear, Trump and the White House, that Trump ordered Pentagon Chief James Mattis to assassinate Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in April of 2017.
No, the book is fiction. I heard somewhere where they said the assassination of President Assad by the United States never even discussed. The book is total fiction.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has reaffirmed his commitment to denuclearizing Korean Peninsula by the end of President Trump's first term in office, saying his faith in the president remains unchanged. That's according to a senior South Korean diplomat who met with Kim ahead of a planned summit between leaders of the North and South later this month. In remarks to the South Korean envoy, Kim said he was frustrated over skepticism over what he's called very significant and meaningful steps toward ending the prospect of war on the peninsula. India's Supreme Court has overturned a law criminalizing consensual gay sex in a major victory for LGBTQI groups. The ruling voids a portion of the Indian Penal Code written by Britain's colonial government in the 1860s, which, although rarely enforced, made gay sex a crime punishable by up to life in prison. Back in the United States, Vice President Mike Pence administered the oath of office Wednesday to former U.S. Senator John Kyle, who fills the Senate seat left vacant after the death of Arizona's John McCain last month. Kyle is a Republican who represented Arizona in the Senate for 18 years. After retiring from Congress in 2013, Kyle joined the prominent law firm Covington and Burling, where he worked as a lobbyist on behalf of clients from Wall Street, Big Pharma, and the weapons industry. Kyle also worked to advance Judge Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination through the Senate. Kyle has said he will serve as Arizona's junior senator until a special election in 2020. In Chicago, jury selection's underway in the murder trial of white police officer Jason Van Dyke, who's charged in the killing of 17-year-old African-American Laquan McDonald in October 2014. The killing was captured on a police dash cam video released under court order, which clearly contradicted police claims about the shooting. The video shows the teenager posing no threat and walking away from the officers before Van Dyke opens fire 16 times. On Wednesday, about 100 protesters gathered near the Cook County Criminal Courthouse as the trial got underway. This is activist William Calloway.
And if he's acquitted, it's not just going to be the South Side, it's not just going to be the West Side, but it's going to be every side of this city that's going to rise up and that's going to demand justice and shut this city down.
And in Louisiana, police arrested 4 people Wednesday as they held a peaceful sit-in protest at a construction site for the 163-mile Bayou Bridge pipeline. The pipeline is being built by Energy Transfer Partners, the same company behind the controversial Dakota Access Pipeline. All 4 of those arrested Wednesday face felony charges under a harsh new anti-protest law signed by Louisiana's governor earlier this year. This is water protector Sherry Voitlin speaking as she was tackled and arrested by police.
Stop choking her!
We need you here now. We need you now. Come.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Judge Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation hearing enters its 3rd day today. On Wednesday, Capitol Police arrested 73 people protesting Kavanaugh's nomination. The protests began almost immediately when Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley tried to begin the hearing.
Yesterday was just opening statements. It was only our time as committee members that we wasted on disruption and disorder over procedural matters. But today is different.
Protesters included Women's March organizers from 26 states. Among them was a teenager who stood on a chair and said, quote, "I'm 18 and I'm here for the youth of the country. You're ruining my future." When questioned about judicial independence, Kavanaugh said, quote, "No one is above the law in our constitutional system." But he refused to answer Senator Dianne Feinstein about whether a president has to respond to a subpoena.
My time's going to run out very quickly. Let me just ask you this. Can a sitting president be required to respond to a subpoena?
So that's a hypothetical question about what would be an elaboration or a difference from U.S. v. Nixon's precise holding.
That's right.
And I think going with the Justice Ginsburg principle, which is really not the Justice Ginsburg alone principle, it's everyone's principle on the current Supreme Court. And as a matter of the canons of judicial independence, I can't give you an answer on that hypothetical question.
Judge Kavanaugh also faced questions on gun control and Roe v. Wade, which he called, quote, an important precedent of the Supreme Court that has been reaffirmed many times. Senator Lindsey Graham asked for clarity about Kavanaugh's outlook on the use of military force after the 9/11 attacks.
So when somebody says post 9/11 that we've been at war, and it's called the war on terrorism, do you generally agree with that concept?
I do, Senator, because Congress passed the authorization for use of military force, which is still in effect.
For more, we're joined by 2 guests here in New York. Hina Shamsi is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union's National Security Project. She recently wrote a piece titled On National Security, Kavanaugh has a history of extreme deference to the president. And Vince Warren's executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which joined more than 180 groups in a statement opposing Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation, saying he's an ideological extremist who lacks the fair-mindedness necessary to serve a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Vince, let's begin with you. This letter that you wrote, why are you so deeply concerned about Judge Kavanaugh?
If you look back at Judge Kavanaugh, Kavanaugh's record, what you see is someone who is deeply, deeply hostile towards the rights that flow to people. And Republicans will talk about him as a centrist, as someone who's fair, as somebody who follows the law, but they're looking at it the wrong way. If you look at this particular nominee on the spectrum of are they in favor of presidential and state power and corporate power versus are they in favor of people power, almost invariably he will go as deeply as he can towards state and corporate power, whether we're talking about reproductive rights, racial justice, voting rights. It's a disaster. And I think it's an important time for us because with Anthony Kennedy vacating the seat, we're really looking at several decades of a very hard-right Supreme Court that's going to be a real challenge for the legal organizations that are trying to vindicate the rights of the people.
And Hina, I mean, in addition to what Vince pointed out about the fact that Kavanaugh tends to side with state and corporate power, your piece is called On National Security. Kavanaugh has a history of extreme deference to the president. So talk about your concerns about him with respect to the positions that he's taken in cases he's been involved in on national security issues.
So the ACLU, as a matter of policy, doesn't take positions for or against Supreme Court nominees, but we do think it's incredibly important for Congress and the public to be informed about their record. And we analyzed Judge Kavanaugh's national security cases and found that he has extreme deference to presidential claims of unchecked authority in the name of war and national security, a hostility to enforcing constraints imposed by binding international law on government action, again in the name of war and national security, and an unwillingness to recognize judicial remedies for individuals who've been harmed by constitutional and human rights violations.
Speaking of human rights violations, Judge Kavanaugh said under oath during his 2006 confirmation to the appellate court in D.C. he's not involved in the Bush administration's rules governing detention of combatants. Senator Dick Durbin pushed back on this claim at Wednesday's hearing, but Kavanaugh still insisted his testimony was accurate.
We're involved in the discussions about access to counsel for detainees. You confirmed this during the meeting we had in my office, and there are multiple media reports as well. You were involved in discussions regarding detained U.S. combatants Yasser Hamdi and Jose Padilla. You confirmed that in our meetings, and there are emails that support that fact. You were involved, and this is one I want to be specific about, you were involved with President Bush's 2005 signing statement on Senator John McCain's amendment banning cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of detainees, and you confirmed that in the meeting. There were no exceptions in your answer given to me in 2006, not for litigation or detainee access to counsel or the McCain torture amendment. So if those three, based on the limited documents which we've been given, are obvious, what were you trying to tell me here? Did you really disclose accurately your role?
Yes, I understood the question then and my answer then, and I understood Stan.
People have human rights. We're allowed to make our own medical decisions.
Go ahead.
I understood the question then and the answer then, and I understand the question now and the answer now to be 100% accurate.
So that was Judge Kavanaugh. When he was asked again about his role in the Bush administration's torture program, the torture report released by Senator Feinstein showed he was not aware of the program.
The policies that are reflected and described in Senator Feinstein's extensive, thorough report were very controversial, as you know, Senator. The enhanced interrogation techniques and the legal memos that were involved in justifying some of those techniques also were very controversial when they were disclosed in 2004. And I was not involved. I was not read into that program, not involved in crafting that program, nor crafting the legal justifications for that program. In addition to Senator Feinstein's report, the Justice Department did a lengthy Office of Professional Responsibility report about the legal memos that had been involved to justify some of those programs. My name's not in that report, Senator. because I was not read into that program and not involved.
So that's Judge Kavanaugh speaking at the hearing, which was continually interrupted by protesters decrying everything from human rights and many other issues. Hina Shamsi, can you translate this all for us? What do we know and what don't we know about Kavanaugh's involvement in these decisions during the Bush administration, whom he served for a number of years? What documents have been released, what haven't, what's on the record, and what about what he actually was willing to admit?
You know, disappointingly, little is on the record. And part of the reason for that is that, as Democratic senators have pointed out, they do not have the majority of the records from Judge Kavanaugh's time in the White House. He held 2 different positions in the White House, and they don't have the majority of records from that time. And I think one important thing to point out because they haven't been produced, they've been withheld on claims of privilege. There's a set of unusual and unprecedented refusals to provide information. And that's a problem because we need Congress to exercise its authority here. And the public also needs to know about this man who's set to hold a position that will be so important. But one important clarification that Senator Feinstein issued after Judge Kavanaugh talked about not being mentioned in the torture report, and Senator Feinstein talked about how limited the scope of the torture report was because the Senate Intelligence Committee didn't get White House records, and so it wouldn't have discussed any role that Judge Kavanaugh might have played. But if I may, what we do know is his hostility to to opening the courthouse doors to victims of human rights abuses like torture in case after case, including one where the ACLU represented a man who was detained and abused by FBI agents abroad, 3 different countries in the Horn of Africa over a period of months, secret proxy detention. And the panel opinion in the D.C. Circuit refused to recognize that he could exercise his right to a remedy in court because they said it was in the context of a counterterrorism investigation overseas. And Judge Kavanaugh went out of his way to write a separate opinion saying that there shouldn't be a remedy recognized for any kind of these investigations overseas. So that in itself is a problematic opinion.
Well, can I ask you about one of the cases that you raise in your piece, the 2010 Al-Bihani case? What it said, you mentioned international law, his position on the jurisdiction of international law in the U.S. If you could speak specifically about what the impact of his position was on the AUMF, the authorization for use of military force, saying that it's not limited by principles of international law.
Yes. So in that case, Al-Bahani, and in other cases, what Judge Kavanaugh has shown is his hostility to binding international law, including the Geneva Conventions, as a constraint on government action, whether by president or the Congress. And in his view, courts shouldn't construe congressional statutes, for example, with a reference to international law's constraints, unless Congress specifically says they should. And what that does, that's outside of the judicial mainstream and outside of long-standing doctrine where the Supreme Court has said that, in fact, courts should ensure that they construe domestic law consistent with international law unless Congress says otherwise. So that's really turning a standard on its head. And Judge Kavanaugh's opinions, which would argue for presidential authority to detain prisoners, even without congressional authorization, other constraints, that would give the president extreme power, unchecked power, and that's a problem.
I want to turn to Senator Patrick Leahy questioning Judge Kavanaugh during Wednesday's hearing about whether he'd lied during previous sworn testimony about his knowledge of warrantless surveillance.
When you were in the White House, did you ever work with John Yoo on the constitutional implications of any warrantless surveillance program?
Well, I can't rule that. Right in the wake of September 11th, it was all hands on deck on all fronts.
Senator Patrick Leahy questioning Judge Kavanaugh during the hearing. I also want to say that Leahy tweeted yesterday, the senior senator from Vermont, between 2001 and 2003, Republican Senate staffers hacked in to install 4,670 files on controversial Bush judicial nominees from 6 Democrats, including me, Leahy tweeted. He went on, this scandal amounted to a digital Watergate, not unlike Russia's hacking of the DNC. The ringleader worked closely with Kavanaugh in pushing these controversial nominees. Kavanaugh testified he had no reason to suspect anything untoward. He said, today I began confronting him with the many reasons why he would have known there was something deeply wrong here. So there are 2 different issues. Yeah. One is the surveillance. And if you could respond to that, Vince Warren.
Absolutely. We have to remember that back right after 9/11, as Judge Kavanaugh said, in terms of the fog of war, there was a massive surveillance program that began here in the United States. And the Center for Constitutional Rights, the ACLU, and others had litigated and continued to litigate in various ways some of those cases. What we're looking at is the question here is whether what his involvement was in that massive surveillance program. And I think what's deeply troubling is then as now, we've not gotten any clear on the record answers about high-level or even low-level officials' participation in these programs. That they are always pushing the question aside. And I think this is a really key issue because now we have a Supreme Court nominee who arguably played a role in facilitating, in thinking up, in moving forward some of the spying programs, which courts have found to be deeply problematic and unconstitutional. And I think that's relevant for Congress to be able to determine whether this is a viable nominee to sit on the Supreme Court. It is likely that under this administration that we'll be seeing similar types of activities, even perhaps ones that the courts have said were not a problem. And it might give this administration a second bite at the apple for some of these questions.
Hina, could you also respond to that? What we know of Kavanaugh's position on mass surveillance in the context of the 2013 Snowden revelations, and where he stood relative to other judges on the D.C. Circuit on that question.
Absolutely. So in 2015, Judge Kavanaugh issued a decision that he went out of his way to analyze. It wasn't joined by any other judge on the D.C. Circuit, and it was in a case that arose out of Edward Snowden's disclosures in 2013 that the government, that the NSA had been conducting a bulk surveillance program of Americans' phone records. And Judge Kavanaugh defended that as constitutional. He did that in a couple of different ways that are problematic. One, he argued that the bulk collection program under Section 215 of the Patriot Act did not even amount to a search under the Fourth Amendment because it involved collection of Americans' phone numbers, in essence, as opposed to the contents of their call. But in doing so, he relied on a singularly inapt 1970s case that involved the Supreme Court upholding warrantless collection of an individual criminal suspect's phone records over a limited period of time, 3 days. And that is a very different context than a bulk program collecting phone records of millions of Americans. He also said that even if the Fourth Amendment were to apply, the search would be reasonable because claims of national security outweighed the impact on individual Americans' privacy.
Can you talk about the significance of his positions in the Bush White House? What it means to be in the White House counsel's office, what it means to be staff secretary, Hina? Why this is so key, and the fact that well over 100,000 documents have not been released is so significant.
Well, you know, those are significant positions with the White House at a time when the Bush administration was carrying out some of its most rights-abusive policies and programs in the post-9/11 era. And what we don't know is the extent to which Judge Kavanaugh had a basis for participating, or whether if, as he seems to have conveyed this, he was essentially acting as traffic cop without weighing in on the substance of opinions. But what Congress doesn't have and what the public doesn't have is the records from that time in order to be able to know for sure one way or the other.
I would just want to add that in the White House counsel context, that anybody that works in a law office knows that these are not solitary, where you don't sit in your office and don't tell anybody what you're doing. These are consultative processes, and people will go to different other folks and say, what do you think of this concept? How should I address this question? So just by virtue of the fact that his name doesn't appear necessarily on memos doesn't mean that he didn't have an involvement, and particularly in creating the germ of what the legal theory is going to be.
And it also means a lot of people know what his views are on these issues.
Absolutely.
Let's turn to Judge Kavanaugh responding to a question about Roe v. Wade at the confirmation hearing.
One of the important things to keep in mind about Roe v. Wade is that it has been reaffirmed many times over the past 45 years, as you know. And most prominently, most importantly, reaffirmed in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992.
Judge Kavanaugh at his hearing, and one of the few moments he wasn't interrupted at that second by someone being taken out. There were more than, 66 protesters in the room, 7 protesters outside who were arrested. But Vince Warren.
Yeah, and just on the protest note, in listening to him trying to respond and hearing people being dragged out of the chamber, I mean, that's what our democracy sounds like. It was an extraordinary moment, and I think it was quite good. And frankly, I think that the nominees need to be a little rattled, particularly when they're giving answers like this one. Senator Feinstein asked him point blank about his view prior to this, about his view about women being harmed and women dying and women killing, and asking about being killed and asking what his view was on that. And he gave this very pat answer, which is, of course, everybody knows that Roe versus Wade is important precedent. I'm not sure when he was talking about Planned Parenthood versus Casey as being precedent on precedent. I'm not sure what that means. But what he didn't say is he didn't say that he will uphold either of those two precedents. He recognized that they were important. He didn't say that he recognized that that women are in jeopardy if they don't have access to those rights. And he also didn't say that the state could be constrained in their denial of those rights in any particular way. So it was a very artful non-answer that was, troubling and should not give anybody any sense of peace around that question.
Well, I want to go to another issue that people have raised concerns about. At Wednesday's confirmation hearing, Vermont Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy asked Judge Kavanaugh whether Trump has an absolute right to pardon himself.
The question of self-pardons is something I have never analyzed. It's a question that I have not written about. It's a question, therefore, that's a hypothetical question that I can't begin to answer in this context as a sitting judge and as a nominee to the Supreme Court.
The other half.
So, Vince, can you respond to that, whether Trump has the right to pardon himself and why that's especially significant?
Well, it's an important issue legally because actually there are folks that disagree on whether the president can or cannot. So while I don't agree with Judge Kavanaugh on virtually anything else that he said, I think that it's actually a reasonable answer to say that I haven't researched that question. It is novel. No one has raised it before. And it's not necessarily something that you would want to have answered here. But here's what he should have said. He should have said that that's an open question. I would look into that very, very seriously if that issue gets raised. And I would, frankly, find it troubling if we did live in a republic where the president had such power that he could commit crimes and then pardon himself for doing them, at least in terms of the federal crimes. I mean, that's, I think, the answer that I would like to hear, that, of course, I would never hear from a hearing like that. But I think that's the right way to analyze that question. And why it's important is because we are more likely than ever to see that factual scenario go from the hypothetical that he'd been talking about in this hearing to reality. And we might be facing that that question in the next couple of years.
I wanted to end with this op-ed piece that has shocked the nation. The White House scrambling to ferret out disloyal members of President Trump's inner circle after the New York Times published an anonymous op-ed column today. It says was written by a senior administration official claiming that a quiet resistance is underway seeking to constrain Trump's worst impulses. In this extraordinary piece, the unnamed official writes, many of the senior officials in his own administration are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. The author goes on to write, ours is not the popular resistance of the left. We want the administration to succeed and think that many of its policies have already made America safer and more prosperous. But we believe our first duty is to our country, and the president continues to act in a manner that is detrimental to the health of our republic. The op-ed's author calls Trump's impulsive, erratic, ill-informed, and reckless with half-baked ideas. And the author claims members of Trump's cabinet discussed invoking the Constitution's 25th Amendment, but later decided against it, the amendment allowing for the removal of a president who's unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. Vince Warren.
I tweeted about this yesterday, and I said that it was both extraordinary and outrageous. And I think what's extraordinary is that there are people within the administration that are working to undermine this president. That's not nothing. And I think particularly when you talk about the 25th Amendment, which was passed in the 1960s, it's only been invoked 6 times, but never Section 4. There are 4 sections to the 25th Amendment. Section 4 is the one in which the vice president can ask for the removal of the president because the president can't do his job. That's never been invoked before, although it's been discussed under in the Reagan administration in 1987, 1988. They had a discussion about it, apparently. But what is outrageous, I think, is, number one, that inside official would dare to call his or herself part of the resistance. That is not the resistance. It is not only not the popular resistance. Let's think about what they're resisting. They're resisting what we're all resisting, which is, of course, Trump's horrible, ill-conceived and impetuous urges. But what they are not resisting are the horrible and cruel policies that administration is putting in. They're high-fiving themselves in that administration when they criminalize immigrants, when they are getting rid of the EPA, when they're turning public education on its head. That to them is a victory. So part of me says, if it's so outrageous, why did everybody else in America realize that he was going to be the disaster that he was, but you decided that you wanted to go work there? So I think that I think they're
clearly saying they want to push that agenda forward. It's the other parts of Trump's personality that are concerned is thwarting that agenda.
Exactly. Well, you can't jump. If you're jumping ship, that means that you got on the boat to begin with. So that's part of the problem. And then, of course, not surprisingly, President Trump comes out there and says, "We demand that you turn over the names of these people." That is simply not going to happen. That could very well be another case that's going to the Supreme Court, as we've seen in terms of New York Times versus Sullivan. This is my takeaway is that op-ed gave us nothing that we didn't already know, but it gave us a little bit more context into how desperate this administration is. And frankly, I think that it is crumbling. It's entropy, and it's crumbling internally. And I think we can mark this moment historically to say this was the beginning of the end.
Well, we want to thank you both for being with us. Vince Warren is the head of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Hina Shamsi is director of the ACLU's National Security Project. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, well, James Mattis and Secretary of State Pompeo are in India. So we'll go to New Delhi and speak with Arundhati Roy, among other things, about the raids on dissidents' homes. Stay with us. Total destruction to your mind by Swamp Dogg. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis are in New Delhi today for talks aimed at deepening military and trade ties between India and the United States. India is the largest weapons importer in the world. Pompeo spoke earlier today in Delhi.
Our two nations are united by shared values of democracy, respect for individual rights, and a shared commitment to freedom.
Pompeo and Mattis's trip comes just a week after the Indian government conducted raids across the country, targeting prominent human rights activists, lawyers, poets and critics of the Narendra Modi government. At least 5 people were arrested. The Indian government has accused them of inciting violence and having suspected links to Maoist rebels.
Critics say the arrests are part of a broader attempt by Modi's government to silence dissidents ahead of next year's general election. We go right now to New Delhi, India, where we're joined by the prize-winning author and activist Arundhati Roy to talk about U.S.-Indian ties, last week's raids, and today's historic judgment by the Indian Supreme Court legalizing gay sex. The court today overturned a 157-year-old colonial-era law known as Section 377. Arundhati Roy won the Booker Prize in 1997 for her first novel, The God of Small Things. Her most recent novel is titled The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Arundhati, welcome back to Democracy Now! Why don't you start off by talking about top U.S. officials coming to firm up military ties with India, just as you and a number of critics have held a news conference after the Modi government raided critics' homes. Explain what's taking place in India today.
Well, I guess it's not a contradiction, because India is becoming a militarized state, and the militarization is not necessarily just aimed at countries outside, like Pakistan. It's aimed at controlling a population, a very diverse population, and the Modi administration, Modi himself, as well as many of his ministers, belong to an organization of which I have spoken many times, called the RSS, who want India to become what is known as a Hindu nation, which would involve a sort of clamp down on an array of different voices, on minorities, on people who think differently. In a way, India is a country of minorities when you look at caste and ethnicity and religion. So, weapons import would be important to control the home population as well as the outside. And while Pompeo and Mattis are here, maybe you'd like us to keep them for you here, since they claim to be these great evangelical Christians. We are marking the 10th anniversary of the massacre of Christians in Kandhamal by Hindu vigilante groups. In fact, before he became the Prime Minister, Modi was banned from coming to the U.S., and technically the reason was not the attack on Muslims, but the attack on Christians, which goes on unabated. So maybe they'd like to talk about that too while they're here.
Well, I want to just point out, the scale of the increase of U.S. arms sales to India in the last years. Arms imports from the U.S. to India rose no less than 557% between 2008, 2012 and 2013, 2017. The U.S. is now the number 2 weapons supplier to India after Russia. But I want to turn to the concerns that you've raised about these weapons imports, not targeting not just Pakistan and others outside India, but what are perceived increasingly increasingly the large numbers of people within India who are perceived as a threat to the Modi government, among them these activists who were arrested last week. Now, you've said that the situation in India today, following these activists' arrests, constitutes more or less a coup against the constitution, and also that it could potentially be more dangerous than the emergency state that was declared by Indira Gandhi in 1975. So could you talk about some of your concerns and what you think this means for where India is headed?
Well, yes, I said that because, while the emergency was a terrible moment in the 70s for the people of this country, and civil rights were suspended and hundreds of people were arrested and put into prison, what you're seeing now is a different scenario. It's a script that was written almost 100 years ago, and you're seeing this administration right now at its most dangerous because polls and analysis of real voting data show a sharp dip in its popularity. And the reasons for that are not just the spreading of this manifesto of hatred, but also the fact that Modi's announcement of demonetization, the delegitimization of 80% of the currency in November 2016. Today, a few days ago, the Reserve Bank came out with figures which were shocking, which said that 99% of the currency has returned to the banking system. The Guardian did a story saying it cost India about 1.5 million jobs, and that the GDP dropped by perhaps a whole percentile. So there is that. There's a massive scandal brewing about the purchase of Rafale fighter jets from France, which is a scandal the scale of whose corruption seems to be unimaginable. There is a lot of disaffection, and at this time they seek to change the script, and so by arresting these very well-known lawyers and activists, people who are vociferous, people who represent the most vulnerable populations, both in court as well as in the media and so on, it's a way of silencing a massive population, So it might sound very minor that you just put people under house arrest, and while the court decides whether or not they can be arrested now because the matter is in court, but actually it's a very, very serious thing. And most significant is that there is a huge unrest. The Muslims have been targeted and more or less erased from electoral mathematics. Now there's a huge amount of unrest among the Dalit community. Now these activists who are being accused of being Maoists and sort of fomenting violence in a big rally that took place on the 1st of January 2018 and a day earlier on the 31st of December. It's a way of targeting Dalits, of insulting sort of Dalit aspiration by imputing that, it's all created by these Maoists, and these are professors, lawyers, people who are working very openly and whose beliefs are pretty clear and who've been writing for years about the things they believe in. So there is a deep mischief afoot. And it's a very, very dangerous situation because, of course, initially they accused these 5 people of being part of fomenting violence at a meeting called the Elgar Parishad on December 31st. Then it turned out that, they were not there at the meeting. Then they claimed they were part of an assassination plot against Modi, which is, of course, an old theme, right from 2005. There have been these claims, and people have also been just executed, extrajudicial executions of people who were called terrorists plotting to kill Modi. So in a way, they are lucky that they survive and are alive. But now, the script keeps changing. What they're accused of keeps changing. So right now, we are being told that they are purchasing an immense amount of weapons and planning unrest across the city. And I don't know how to explain how ludicrous this is. Actually know most of these people, and to accuse them of this is just corny.
And Arundhati Roy, it's not only, of course, as you point out, these prominent people, but there are thousands of people being arrested in different states in India. And if you can talk about the significance of this and what states are particularly being targeted.
Well, there are scenarios which are complex and different. One is, as I said at that press conference and in my press release, that today in India, to be murdered is a crime, to be lynched is a crime, to be poor is a crime. To speak up for the disadvantaged makes you, part of a plot to overthrow the government. So you have, on the one hand, sort of a whole scenario, a landscape in which there are vigilante mobs who have beaten people to death, who have axed people to death, who put up these videos on YouTube, who do so with impunity, who have been honored and garlanded by ministers for doing so when they come out of, their very short spells in jail, when they come out on bail. So you have an administration that gives them, it doesn't itself involve itself in killing, but it has made it very clear that vigilante mobs, cow protection mobs, and so on are not going to be punished. And you can imagine in a country like this, with the level of unrest, the level of poverty, the level of frustration because there are no jobs, you can imagine what this kind of immunity creates. Yesterday there was yesterday there was an article in the newspaper saying that 3,000 PhD students and 28,000 graduates applied for jobs as peons in the police department, where the qualification was class 4. You had to have passed up to class 5, and you should know how to ride a bicycle. So, just giving you an example of the extent of frustration that can spill over into violence. And when you say that you have impunity, and if you're not getting a job, you can just beat a Muslim to death, that sort of situation. Then you have the displacement that I have written about and spoken about on your show many times. Huge areas of the forest cordoned off while the forests are sought to be cleared, indigenous people being pushed off their lands. The forests are now isolated. Lawyers, journalists, activists have been pushed out. So one doesn't know what's going on in there. And now they are going after what they call urban Maoists or urban Naxalites, So that means everybody who disagrees with them. And they don't want to name indigenous communities or Dalit communities because unlike the Muslims, they need this, what they call vote bank. So now you call them Maoists. You don't name them for what they are. You don't even give them the dignity of being people fighting for their own rights or their own aspirations. And then you go after them. So you can row these two boats at one time. On the one hand, pretend you're very sensitive to Ambedkar and to Dalit aspiration, while on the other hand, undermine them completely and arrest activists, but not call them Dalits, call them Maoists.
Arundhati Roy, we have to break. We're going to come right back. Arundhati Roy, the prize-winning author, activist, speaking to us from New Delhi. When we come back, we're going to speak to you about the Indian Supreme Court's decision today, this historic decision legalizing gay sex. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Be no burden, be polite, say goodbye and say hello. Wait your turn, sit up proud, go to bed now, sweet dreams. Find the kind heart, rest
Anushka Shankar featuring Alav Lenz. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
India's Supreme Court has overturned a law criminalizing consensual gay sex in a major victory for LGBTQI groups. The ruling voids a portion of the Indian Penal Code written by Britain's colonial government in the 1860s, which, although rarely enforced, made sodomy a crime punishable by up to life in prison. Activists are holding celebrations today across India.
We are, but today and anymore from now onwards, we are not criminal. We can live our life as who we are. We are really happy. Thank you, Supreme Court.
Arundhati Roy is our guest today, activist and author, speaking to us from New Delhi, India, author of The God of Small Things, as well as her latest book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Arundhati, your response today.
Well, what can I say? You know, how badly we needed this. And I think it's phenomenal judgment coming at this point of time when things are closing down on people, you know. So I hope it's the beginning of something wonderful. I couldn't be happier about this. And I hope it's a sign of spine also from the Supreme Court. You know, it is a sign of spine because this is something that is against the grain of the people who rule us today. And it's a wonderful thing that's happened, totally wonderful thing. At a time, of course, let's not forget, where people are being beaten to death for what they call love jihad, you know. When you marry or when you have a relationship with someone who's not of the same caste as you, you can get beheaded. So these are the love laws which I wrote about in The God of Small Things. This particular moment is a beautiful moment, but I hope it becomes a moment that changes the nature of the way we look at love.
Well, Arundhati Roy, as these thousands of people are protesting today, this new Supreme Court ruling, thousands and thousands of people yesterday were marching. Workers and peasants were marching in central Delhi opposing the Modi government. Could you explain what those protests were about and the counter-protests that are taking place in some states today that have been organized by upper caste people?
The people today, of course, celebrating the Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, not protesting.
Oh, I'm so sorry, my mistake.
Yesterday there was a massive march in Delhi. There was a wonderful moment of celebration. But yesterday, yes, you're right, there was a march in which about 100,000 farmers marched from across the country because of the distress in the agricultural sector, you know, absolute distress. I mean, we have more than 200,000 farmers who've been in debt, who have committed suicide. You have a situation in which agriculture is being made almost unviable. You know, so farmers are marching, demanding a minimum support price for their crops. So you have all of this that is closing down on this government, and all of us await the new fireball that will fall on us to distract people from these very real issues that are affecting them in real time. You know, they don't need, however much propaganda the media puts out, however many lies are told on certain sections of the mainstream TV channels, the point is ultimately people are experiencing this for themselves. They don't need news anchors to tell them everything is all right, you know. People don't have jobs. People who were promised a sum of 15 lakhs, I'm not sure what that is in dollars, but it's a large amount of money. When Modi and Amit Shah campaigned, they said
5 seconds,
every Indian will get 15 lakhs in their bank account. And instead, What you had was the opposite, with demonetization.
We have to break
they
right now, but we're going to go
everything.
back to part 2 of our discussion with Arundhati Roy, author and activist based in New Delhi, India. I'm Amy Goodman with Nurmeen Shaikh.